We still have a couple minutes.
Morning, Clayton.
Morning, Clayton.
Morning, everybody. Morning, sir.
Hi.
So Cindy, was George good for the meeting? Did you no correspondence from him?
Hello.
Hi, Mark. Good morning.
Let me make sure you're joining it.
Yeah.
George did not tell me that he was not going to be attending, so
Okay. Yeah, hold on, I gotta reboot my camera. Everything just kind of froze up on me.
okay.
All right, so I've got 10 o'clock. Do we want to get started or do we want to stall and give George a couple minutes?
Well, Mr. Chair, you do have a quorum, so if you'd like to go ahead and call the meeting to order. Oh, and there's George joining us. Perfect.
There's George. Hi, George. All right, so why don't we get started? I'd like to call to order the City of St. Helena Water Advisory Board regular meeting Friday, July 16th, 10 a.m. Roll call, please.
Chair Randall,
Present.
Vice Chair Ortiz, oh, I can't hear your sound, Diana. Well, I will note that you are present, and maybe you can work on your sound. Board Member Chisler. I think you might be frozen. Oh, you're here. Okay. And Member Chateau
Here.
and Member Hale is absent.
I'd like to recognize Diana's wonderful mime imitation. It was really good. Thank you, Diana. Anyway, let's move on to item 3, public forum. This is an opportunity for anybody of the public to discuss anything not on the agenda. The board will not take any action on anything discussed during public forum. Cindy, do you show anybody in the waiting room or any other public members?
We actually do not have any public attendees.
All right, so we will close the public forum, move on to item 4, reports by staff and board. Any reports from any staff or board members? Seeing none, we will move on to item 5, new business, an update on the phase 2 water emergency. Martin, take it away. I think you're muted, Martin.
Can you hear me now? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, we got you now. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to give a very brief and quick update on our post-June 2021 production numbers. So every month after the month ends, we post a monthly water report on our website. And I wanted to highlight some key numbers and water conservation efforts that were made during this last month. And I'm gonna share a slide, Cindy, if I'm able to.
Just a minute. Oh, you should be able to.
Okay. Oh. And I don't know if everyone can see that on here. So what we have in front of us should be an overview of our June water production numbers. I've highlighted it and compared it to June 2019, June 2020, and June 2021. And what we're showing here is from June 2020 to June 2021, we have about a 22.5% reduction as far as water production goes. So that's really good. I know in the Raftellus presentation and ultimately in the phase 2 water emergency, our goal is about 31%. So 20 or 22.5 is pretty close to that. So I just wanted to share those numbers there. This information is presented in acre feet. And again, this is post 2021 June numbers. Stop sharing.
Great, thank you. Anything else, Martin, from you?
That was it on my part as far as just an update goes. We did run a new analysis and forecast as what the current trend of this 22.5% reduction would do to the Bell Canyon Reservoir. So I do want to share just one more slide if I can here. Give me 1 second. This one here. So what we have in front of us now should be a forecast of our Bell Canyon Reservoir. And I do want to just go over this slide real quick. So this is our current capacity as of July 2021. And that 306 acre feet, it does not include the 25% number that we would have to leave aside for emergency or fire suppression. So 306 acre feet is what we have available without that 25% number. On the top, we'll notice here, I went every other month because of this slide would have been too long, but this is usage based on current trend with the 22.5% reduction. This is only for Bell Canyon Reservoir, so it's not showing the usage from Napa Water or Stonebridge wells. So what we have here is basically this is how much we'll need to use the reservoir if we were to maintain this type of reduction for the remainder of the year. And we leave off at May 2022 because that's the new benchmark that we have based off the new urgency ordinance that we're basing everything off of that May and how much water we have remaining. So there's a couple columns or rows I'm going to highlight here. This right here is going to be remaining water supply without incorporating any rainfall numbers. So we are able to maintain rain in our reservoir between October 15th and April 15th. Anything that we do gain outside of those months, it has to be released. So we modeled it on a very low rainfall of 10%. So if you notice that rain does make an impact on these remaining water supply numbers. And Anna, I think you have a question. Go ahead.
I do. Thank you so much. I was just wondering, when you said the 206, does that include the emergency water that's
No.
not?
Great question. Just to clarify, so that's going to be 306 that we have available to use without that 25%. So in reality, the 25% makes up about 596. So that right now we're at around 306 plus 596 is what we have available currently.
Okay, so the 306 is what we can use and then still have the water available for emergency.
That is correct.
Thank you so much.
Yes. And again, we also ran a model for 20% rainfall, which would be low. And we highlighted one as an expected normal rainfall, which would be 30 inches. And one thing I want to highlight here is our Bell Canyon capacity is 2383 acre feet. So it would, if we were to have a normal rainfall year, we would get to that number in around the March timeframe. And that is it, unless there's any questions on where we're at with the reservoir and post-June water production numbers.
I would just add, and thank you, Martine, for the presentation. We are forecasting staying in a phase 2, but that could change if there is some form of system loss, perhaps associated with a fire and a lot of water usage, or some type of catastrophic failure on our system. And we do have a fairly old 12-inch main that runs from Rutherford into the city. And it's a pipe that's continued to leak over time. It's something that at some point in the relatively near future, we're going to need to replace. And it's an example of how vulnerable we are. So in a case where that happens to go down because of some significant failure, it could be possible that we move into a phase 3. If everything holds through the rainy season, we'll be okay, it looks like. And it also assumes continued conservation. So while we're conserving well at 22.5%, it would be even better. We'll leave more water in the reservoir and guard against a very low rainfall season. So it's really important that conservation efforts continue through mid-October and beyond.
Great, thank you, Mark. Any other questions, Martine, from board or staff? Not seeing any, we'll move on to 5.2. Mark?
Thank you. And our city clerk will be sharing her screen for this presentation. This is essentially the same presentation that was made to the council this past Tuesday in a special meeting, because we are announcing and did announce penalties for the first time based on June 2021 usage. And given the fact that this was the first time penalties were applied, and because of the scale of these penalties, and our initial forecast was $2.9 million, so an extraordinarily high number in just a single month. We'll talk more about that as we walk through the water meter reads and the penalty overview. And we'll move to the next slide. So what I'm going to touch on today is a little bit of the history as a reminder about how we arrived and where we are with the water emergency. Talk about the adopted water penalty structure again. Talk about these meter reads and the usage penalties and how they break down based on type of user. And a recommendation of our water ad hoc committee that consisted of the mayor, Mayor Ellsworth, and Councilmember Hardy, and a joint staff ad hoc committee recommendation to apply a penalty forgiveness program in June and July usage. And we'll talk about what that looks like. That was approved by the council on Tuesday. Next slide. So this is a recap. We entered the water emergency phase 1 in June of last year. By late October, we were forecasting limited reservoir capacity that moved us into a phase 2 water emergency. Good news at that time is low water usage in the winter. And by April, we had put together a water penalty structure. Our rate structure did not include a penalty structure. So it was important for us to have policy discussions about what that would look like. After a number of those policy conversations, obviously the structure was adopted, and this body was formed as well in the spring. On April 27th, the council adopted an urgency ordinance that updated the commercial, industrial, and institutional users due to the seasonal nature of the water use. And what was really challenging, particularly for the wineries, was that the code really expected a 10% reduction over prior year based on a winter average. And that winter average is not the time that wineries use water. So this was updated to apply to a prior 3-year average in a non-drought period of time. And And we have typically applied that to be 2017, 2018, and 2019 for the purposes of these billings. And then finally, just as I mentioned, this is the first month that we have penalties applied. Next slide. So this is an overview of the rate structure. Again, you've seen this before, and the policy objective is to provide a strong price signal. So for users that just exceed their allocation, where the accounts could reasonably adjust and reduce their usage below the allocation in subsequent months, there's a minimal penalty for going over. And at the same time, this penalty structure ramps up quite significantly. And the policy intent is to maximize penalties for wasteful water use and for those accounts that require some form of financial compulsion to reduce use. And you see that when you look at the scale of the increase between exceeding use just under 25% and users that exceed more than 100% of the allocation. And when I say users, I'm referring to both the residential and the non-residential side of our accounts. Are there any questions on that slide, on this slide? Okay, so we'll move to the next slide, Cindy. So this is how in terms of the number of accounts that had water penalties applied, we have 900 accounts out of 2,425, so a fairly significant number. It was spread across the board. The asterisk that can be applied to this slide is that 136 of these accounts that were over happen to have a water leak. And so that can be reduced a little bit. And next slide. This is how the penalties have been applied. And this is how we arrived at the $2.9 million figure that I first spoke of. So on the positive front, 63% of the customers, 1,500 plus accounts, had no penalties on them. So that's very good news. Additionally, of the 337 of that 900 had penalties under $100, and that accounted for only about $11,000 of penalties. So when you add those two numbers together, the 63% and the almost 14%, we're at about 77% of our customers had less than $100 in water penalties in the month of June. So that's great news. 3/4 of the customers did not have significant penalties. Obviously, those scale up, and they scale up quite significantly to the point where these numbers are so large that the council ad hoc recommended that we have a council conversation and a policy discussion about the challenges ahead and also the need to conserve, because the more that, and these penalties are obviously intended to encourage conservation, but the scale of these numbers is quite significant. Are there any questions about how these numbers break down?
Hey, Mark, can you talk about, to me, the last, say 10 accounts at the highest end? Any common thread in there? Is this leaks? Is this, did you guys, I assume, looked at specifics?
The next two slides are going to break these numbers a little bit down, and we can talk about how many of them are due to leaks. About a third of the largest leaks, about 30 of those are due to water leaks of the highest.
Okay, then if you're going to get into it, then let's move on.
I was just curious, Mark, will you break down a little bit too, as well as like what type of customers, whether it's the residential side or the commercial side?
Right. So we're going to look at residential versus non-residential and how this breaks down.
Thank you.
Okay, Cindy, we'll go to the next slide. So we're looking at the non-residential, and in this category, this accounted for 12% of the accounts that went over versus 88% of the accounts that were on the residential side that went over. And we're highlighting a couple of lines here. The blue is just underscores that 65% of the non-residential accounts worked within the allocation. And so, and then another 13% were slightly over. So good news here is about 78% of these accounts were within a number that shouldn't be too significant from a penalty perspective or no penalty. So that's good news. We did have 20 leak letters. That simply indicates that our system, when we read meters, is indicating a leak. And the most significant number was tied to those users in the 100 plus category. So 100% of exceeding usage by 100%. What the story that's unfolding here is helping to tell is that our current technology requires the city to drive through town because when we drive through town, we don't necessarily catch every meter read. We have to go back and double check or pull meters because either the meter's not working as well, it's not transmitting as well. It's very labor intensive because, as you know, our accounts are not just at houses and inside the city limits. We have customers that are outside the city limits, and the number of those that have to be rechecked are outside the city limits. So we have a labor intensive process and it takes about 3 days. Our staff can weigh in if I'm not accurately stating how much time, but it's about 3 days, I think, on average, each time we read meters. And the technology will then tell us if the meter has been running for 24 hours continuously, and it has more data once we read. But someday in the future, maybe importantly, closer than later, sooner than later, will be an investment in next generation technology where real-time data will help users that are exceeding potentially going to exceed their usage by their allocation by a significant number, with real-time data, real-time alerts to let them know that the water is running continuously and that there's an issue. And that helps the customer avoid extra expenses. That helps the city retain more water, helps all of us reduce that water usage and catch it a little earlier. So that's a really important investment coming down the road. The scale of these penalties, if the penalties hold long term, that will produce revenue that can then be essentially invested in new technology that will also also result in some significant staff efficiencies when we don't have to drive around town and get meter reads, and the technology will provide us real-time data. So the number of accounts that were more than 50% out of used more than 50% is about 16% here. That's a total of about 46 accounts, and 13 of those were due to water leaks. This is a bit of a short overview of the non-residential side, and then we'll look at the residential side next. So again, the number of residential accounts that did not receive a penalty was very similar to the business side. So they were 65. This is 63. A little bit lower on the numbers under 25%. So good news is that 71% of our customers probably will have bills that don't have too many penalties associated with them. A little higher on the penalties that were associated with allocation or usage beyond 50% of the allocation, so about 23%. And 61 of the 340 accounts were due to ongoing leaks that need resolving. So some significant water use has been associated with the leaks that has resulted in customers with some significant penalties. These leak penalties are going to come to the Water Advisory Board, and the council has asked us to provide some policy guidelines and recommendations for how to evaluate those. So we are working on those now, and we'll be sharing those with you at your next meeting. Any questions about how this residential and non-residential breaks down? Okay. We'll move to the next slide, Cindy. So given the scale of these penalties, $2.9 million, when you back out the water leaks, it looks a little bit more like 2.5 million. we haven't had a lot of time to deeply analyze these numbers. The numbers were calculated last Thursday afternoon. We talked with the water ad hoc members on Friday, and the administrative services director and I, and in partnership with our new city engineer, worked over the weekend to develop a staff report and a presentation for Tuesday. So, and a recommendation. So the recommendation, which was adopted by the council, was to suspend 75% of the June penalties. So that means we would bill for 25% of the June penalties. I believe we are going to bill, the bills will go out on Monday. Today, we are sending letters to those same customers with penalties, and those letters will likely arrive a day or two before the actual bill. And then bill 50% of the penalties in the month of July. But there's an opportunity for every customer to reduce their penalties to zero should they significantly increase their conservation efforts and meet the targets that have been established, that more than 60% of business and non-residential customers are meeting. And that would require the customers to work within their allocation in the months of August, September, October, and November in order to have all of those penalties forgiven. If any month, in any month, those numbers move north of the allocation, then the penalties in June and July would become due, along with the penalties that would be incurred in whatever month the usage was exceeded. And we would work on providing a rebate after November for any customer that was able to keep that allocation low. So the rationale here is to, again, strongly encourage conservation. The customers have complete ownership of whether they're going to end up with a penalty or not at the end of November. It's entirely up to them. The hope is that we can achieve greater conservation and provide essentially an opportunity for the customers to address what is likely a number that in some cases is larger than they were anticipating. Happy to answer any questions you have.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can I ask it?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So what happens if you are conserving, but then there's another leak? Can your amount still be forgiven if you come through our board? Is that how it works? Like, let's say you're on path
Right.
in the conservation efforts, but then all of a sudden, you know, the second or third of the last month, you see you have a leak and you're over again. What happens?
I think there are going to be situations like this where there's a bit of an anomaly. And yes, this is one of the valuable contributions that the Water Advisory Board can help with. So there could be nuances like this where someone does find themselves in that experience. We do have policy guidelines about how often those can be granted. But again, this board has the flexibility to consider each case on a case-by-case basis. And of course, appeals of a decision of this board will go to the council if there's a customer that wants to appeal any decision of yours.
Hey, I just have a comment. Oh, I just have a comment. I received a few phone calls, and something I think that would be helpful probably for the entire Water Advisory Board is if something happens at council level that affects us, that we just kind of get briefed on it kind of before the fact. Because a few people called me, they were mostly friends, that said, "What the hell are you doing?" And then I had to read the Star article, and I was a little bit taken back that just maybe keeping us a little more informed, because the impression was that we made the decision, and I was kind of unaware, and I don't always follow council items, you know, until it hits me in the forehead. So it was just a comment.
Brent, that's a fair recommendation and appreciated. This moved very fast from knowing the number on Thursday afternoon to noticing the meeting on a Sunday to producing the report over the weekend. And I'm on vacation today for my son's 16th birthday, but here we are. So life is
No.
moving very fast these days, and we'll keep that in mind and work to try to keep you apprised of any changes that do occur. And it's important to know, this board to know that the council on July 27th will be talking about our residential and non-residential conservation measures and targets, the code language. This is language that, other than the urgency ordinance that was adopted in April that adjusted how the 10% would be calculated. These numbers, the 65 gallons per person per day and the 10% figure for our non-residential, those are numbers that have been in the code for a while. But we're going to have a conversation on the 27th about those. And in addition to that, we're having a conversation about what we're calling a draft water security framework. Really, this is a document that will essentially organize the various initiatives that we're working on related to water, whether it's an infrastructure initiative, a policy matter, data analytics, a lot of initiatives on the waterfront that we're managing. And this is essentially a way to help the community understand how many of those there are, how they're organized, receive some feedback from the council on how those initiatives are organized. And we're also going to be working on essentially a phased implementation. There's so many different initiatives, we can't do everything at once, and we need to plan an organized approach to how these policy matters and infrastructure projects move forward. So probably good for us to provide a briefing to you after that meeting as well, in terms of the feedback that's received from the city council.
Hey, and Mark, in no way am I boxing your ears on that. I think you're doing a great job. This is a moving target, and it's very difficult. So don't take it in that way at all. Hey, the only other comment, and this probably should have come into public forum, was with the state guidelines of 15% conservation, and I know they're just guidelines. A couple of the public I spoke to said, well, we're only doing 10% for commercial users. Why do the residents seem to be taking the bulk of the conservation? And so, Anna, I don't know if that would be a comment maybe to you at council level discussion, but I think that was a valid point of they felt like we're letting businesses off a little easier than residents, and shouldn't the weight be shared evenly? So I don't think we need to discuss it, just a comment.
Mark,
So any last questions for Mark or anybody else?
I do have a question.
Diana?
Thank you, Mark, for giving this presentation again, and especially on your day off. I appreciate it, and happy birthday to your son, the golden birthday, 16 on the 16th. That's great. One question I have, so I really like this chart, the breakdown of kind of like non-residential and residential. One thing that I'm curious about is, is it possible to have an understanding of how many units that actually translates to for going over? Because I remember in one of the council meetings, it was kind of mentioned, you know, if a large customer goes over a little bit, right, it's like taking a drink from a big straw versus a small customer taking a drink from a little straw. And that's just something I feel like is good to understand, is, you know, maybe there's more residential customers, but they're all little straws, right? And kind of the impact of how many units over were each of those kind of groups in that category are going over.
Right. I'm going to look to Mandy Kellogg, our Assistant Administrative Services Director, who's only been back from vacation for about 2 days. And I was working with our Admin Services Director, April Mitz, before that. But just to go back a little bit and comment on Brent's comments, the residential users account for about 60% of our water usage. So they're the majority of, you know, and the real opportunity is outdoor watering. This is, you know, the way our demand works is it's all associated with outdoor watering, and the 65 gallons per person per day is a pretty standard limit that you would see in a phase 2 type emergency. We're on a 3-phase schedule. Some cities are on a 6-phase conservation or water emergency type of scale, but it's pretty standard fare. And the 10% may be on the lower end if you had a scale. It may be leaning as a business, as a business friendly number. And at the same time, I know our businesses have been through a lot of challenges over the last 12 months, but that's exactly the conversation that the council is going to be talking a little bit about on the 27th. So we can bring you the same conversation after that and any updates that result from that conversation. But that's an important conversation about how the water targets and allocations are, how they can contrast with other agencies. And I know Councilmember Chateau and I have had conversations with other cities and know that sometimes, and we hear different numbers out of different cities. Every city has a different set of limits on their sources of water and the complexities of how they receive their water, what their water demand is, and how that works individually in their cities. So it's not surprising to see differences in terms of how cities work on essentially establishing an allocation target during an emergency. But that's exactly the conversation we're going to have. In terms of units, Mandy, do we have any data that we've been able to pull yet on if you were able to isolate, let's say, the users that were 50% or more or 100% or more of their allocation, how many units that translates to?
We do have a comprehensive list. I have it in front of me, but unfortunately it's every customer all on the same list together. So I would have to go through and kind of sort through it in order to determine which buckets they fall in, but we do have the total number of units that's over.
And Diana, to that point, we are, before knowing who was going to end up on, in the class of customers that were 100% or more beyond, we were reaching out to our largest users historically to make them aware of the city's challenges, the importance of conservation, the coming penalties, just to be sure that we tried to work with our largest users to make sure that we didn't have any surprises on our end or their end because of the supply side on ours, the cost on the business or the resident. And now that we have new data, we're beginning to reach out to some of the largest, the customers with the largest penalties. And we're going to work ourselves from most to least in that order and just try to make sure that they have some awareness of that's coming. And we are receiving a number of telephone inquiries about, where does my usage look? What does my usage look like? There are not a lot of calls yet, but I'm sure when the bills come out, we'll receive a lot more calls when customers have questions. Probably beginning late next.
Thank you. Also, one other question is the city planning on introducing any more additional resources or rebates to support customers with their reduction?
Yes, that's part of the direction on Tuesday, is to inventory a number of opportunities, and also opportunities to acknowledge the conservation that a lot of our customers are making, the sacrifices they're making. So what else can we do to acknowledge and thank those customers for their conservation efforts? And we know that there are casualties sometimes to those conservation efforts. They lose their lawn, they lose trees, they lose shrubs, etc.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions or comments before we adjourn? Good work, Mark and staff. Thanks for pulling all that together. That helps immensely with questions. So have a great weekend, everybody. Appreciate the time, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
That's great. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.